Right, good evening. Thank you to everyone for joining us, and a special welcome to our fellow Texas Club members. I'm Susan Chon, class of 91 and president of the Brown Club of Houston. We have a great event planned for you tonight, and I'll briefly introduce you to my fellow Brown Houston board member and history buff, Paul Verger, class of 73. He's very active in our club and serves as our secretary. He will be moderating tonight's discussion. And with that, I will hand it off to Paul. And also, can you guys please mute yourselves so that we can hear the speakers clearly? Thank you.
Good evening. My role tonight is just simply to introduce our speaker, Andrew Wolfline, class of 86. He sounds like he has a really interesting talk ready for us. Andrew is speaking to us as the trustee of the Anne S.K. Brown Military Collection, which is at Brown, and he's been on the board since 1996, and he has been the presiding trustee since 2013. The collection, as we'll hear, is one of the world's foremost collections of military iconography. The collection uses its vast material of over 28,000 military art images and 20,000 military history books to promote the knowledge of military and naval history from 1500 to 1945. It does this through lectures, museum exhibitions, supporting research and publications. One of the publications that came out of that work is by our speaker himself. Mr. Wolfline is the author of Herbert Knodl's German Armies in Color, published in 2007, a book featuring depictions of the German army units from the 17th to the 20th century. He's also had the pleasure to orchestrate exhibits from the collection that were used to celebrate the beginning of World War I and the centennial of when the Americans got involved in that. These exhibits were done with President Woodrow Wilson House in Washington, D.C. and in the Woodrow Wilson, or the World War I Museum in Kansas City. His day job when he's not helping the board is Andrew is the Chief Strategy Officer of Monex USA, a fintech provider of corporate foreign exchange and international payment services. He has a degree in European history from Brown and an MBA from Harvard Business School. Before we get into it, just note that we will reserve the last 15 to 20 minutes or so for Q&A. If you have any questions you'd like to ask as they come up, note them in the chat box and we'll get to them near the end of the hour. And as I think everybody was aware of when they signed on, the presentation is being recorded. So if you missed something or misheard something, you'll be able to go back and get it and listen to it again and tell your friends about it. With that, Andrew, take it away.
Great, thank you. Susan, I think you're going to share the screen. You're muted.
Sorry, I'm going to share the screen. Yep. 1 second. All right.
Susan will be changing the slides for me, so thank you for that. Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you. And our agenda tonight, really, there are three things I'm going to do. I'm going to talk about the collection as a whole to give you an overview of the array of things that are in the collection. And then we'll look at two of the sort of soldier artists in the collection, Lieutenant de Verger from the American Revolution, and then Lieutenant Faber du Faur, who was in the German state of Württemberg, and he was with Napoleon in the 1812 invasion of Russia. And then we'll have some Q&A at the end. Next, please. So if you were to go into Google on the image search feature and you wrote in Anne S.K. Brown Military Collection, this is the type of imagery that would display. And I thought this is a good place to start because it just shows, if you will, the cornucopia of everything that's in this collection. From you can see swords and books and toy soldiers and all sorts of art. It's a massive collection. It's world renowned. It's one of the preeminent military art collections in the world. So I just sort of wanted to set the stage in that context. Next. Mrs. Brown started this collection in the mid 20th century. She built it up over 4 decades. It's a private collection that she compiled over those decades. She was first, she started with toy soldiers. She was interested as a young girl in the small military figures, seeing actual soldiers marching in parades, Memorial Day parade, that sort of thing. And she got interested in the toy soldiers. And then from there, she got, when she started collecting in earnest, she collected a lot of the military art, the watercolors, paintings, oil paintings, and built that collection up over those 4 decades, the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. And she also had a lot of gratitude for the freedoms we have that are protected by the military. That was another motivating feature for her. And the collection really, it's basically an illustrative history of soldiers at war and peace. And all countries are represented, but the particular strength is in art and units from France, the United Kingdom, Germany, and the German states. So I mentioned France because de Verger is French, and German states because Faber du Faur is from one of the German states that we'll look at tonight. Next, please. So what's in the collection? So there are hundreds of artists that are in the collection. And first and foremost, when you go into the Hay Library, in the gallery, the 6,000 toy soldiers are on display. And I like to think of that as the tip of the iceberg. That's what you see visibly in the gallery there. And they're lined up, chronologically, and we'll take a look at those in a moment. There's 18,000 works of art that are in portfolios, scrapbooks, and albums. So an artist might have a dozen images in his or her scrapbook or portfolio, and so there are 18,000 of those images, and another 15,000 of individual works of art. There are 20,000 books around military history, unit histories, diaries. We're going to look tonight at the de Verger diary as one of many, but they're from many different wars, the diaries of different types of combatants. And in addition to that, there's heraldry, swords, cigarette cards, posters, caricatures. It's just this, as I said, a sort of cornucopia of broad array of things that are in the collection. It's a research collection. The John Hay Library is a research library, so you can't take material out, but you can use it there. So it's used by scholars for their research. It's used by many publishers, museums, television programs, movies. They use material in the collection for their various work that they're involved in. As Paul mentioned, the initial focus in the intro there, 1500 to 1945, that was really the period that Mrs. Brown, when she was collecting, focused on. And then since the mid 80s, after she passed, the collection is a second focus is from 1945 to the present. She donated her collection in 1983, and of these basically 33,000 total images, about 28,000 are accessible through the web. You can see them digitally. Next, please. Just a quick comment here on the organization. So Joe Mizell is the university librarian who oversees all the libraries at Brown. And underneath him, one of those libraries is, of course, the John Hay. And in the John Hay, that is the Special Collections Library. There are many, many special collections in the library. The most prominent is the ASKB Brown Military Collection. And Amanda Strauss is the head librarian in the John Hay. And then our collection, the ASKB Brown Military Collection, has its own curator. So it's the only collection within the John Hay that has its own dedicated curator. Part of the gift from the Brown family to the university included an endowment which supports to this day the salary of the curator. And then the committee of management that I'm involved with, there's about 20 trustees. Half of us approximately are Brown alumni, Brown affiliated, and the other half are folks that have an interest in the topic and have been involved in many of them for many, many years. Just on the left here, you see a couple images here of a Lincoln bust of his head, and this other one, a small image there of stamps. Those are two other sort of prominent collections within the John Hay. The Lincoln collection is quite an impressive collection in itself, and the stamp collection is just an example. You can see the stamps there as well. And next. So as I mentioned, the collection has a curator, Peter Harrington, and he's also a Brown alum. He did his master's at Brown, and he has been the curator since 1989. And he's really a fountain of knowledge of military art and everything in the collection. He's been in there for more than 30 years. You can see here his scholarly production is just prolific over these decades. 14 books, 5 books that he co-authored, 82 articles, book reviews, chapters in other volumes, just really a wide array of scholarship that Peter has done with the material in the collection. Next, please. As I noted, when you go into the collection, the first thing that you see is the toy soldiers. That's sort of the tip of the iceberg, so to speak. And they are lined up in chronological order. I call it sort of the march of history. It starts with the ancient Egyptians, and then the Greeks and the Romans, and it goes right up. Her toy soldier collection goes up really to the start of World War I, the periods depicted in the cabinet. So it's very, it's really an impressive thing to see because there's so many of them spread out in the main gallery in the collection. So it's sort of the signature thing that a lot of people think of when they think of the collection, but it is only really literally the tip of the iceberg. Next. And in the gallery, when you go in, besides the toy soldiers, along the walls, along the 4 walls in the main gallery, there are many of the collection's oil paintings, and there's not so many oil paintings in the collection compared to watercolors, but many of those oil paintings are on the walls. Also, you can see here there's some war bond posters from World War II. So there's some of those on the wall as well. So you have the soldiers on the floor, and then on the wall you have both the oil paintings as well as the posters. Next, please. In the collection of those hundreds of artists, there also are a number of women military artists. And these are just a few of them from the 19th and 20th century, depicting different conflicts. You can see both World War I and World War II, and then some campaigns from the 19th century from some of the different artists, Lady Elizabeth Butler and Caroline Hubert from the 19th century. So that is another element of the collection. And I certainly think we could do an exhibit just on the women military artists in the collection. So that's something I've been thinking we might do. Next. So as Paul mentioned, we had these exhibits commemorating the centennial of the start of World War I in 2014, and then the centennial of the American involvement in the war in 2017. And those exhibits were in Washington, D.C. at the Woodrow Wilson House, and then they moved on to the National World War I Museum in Kansas City. This image in the middle is one of our trustees, Miranda Summers. She's also a Brown alum, did a master's at Brown. She's in active duty in the military. She's also a curator at the Smithsonian, and she's a legislative professional, sort of advising congressmen on military policy. So she has many different things she's doing. She was just visiting. This was the exhibit from 2014 in Washington, D.C. So and what's interesting about the collection is there's so much art in it that we can put together an exhibit with many different artists. So, for example, the exhibit in 2014, it had French artists and German artists and British artists, all the artists of the countries that were involved in the conflict at that time. And then in 2017, the exhibit had many American artists depicting what the Americans were doing in that particular conflict. Next, please. So the collection, it continues to grow. It's not a static collection. And the collection attracts many donations. A lot of people who have material that's of interest to the collection seek out the collection because they want their collection to be associated with a preeminent collection like the ASKB collection. And we had a donation of swords, 17th to 20th century swords. These are actually housed in the Anne Mary Brown Memorial. So they're not in the hay, they're across campus, and they're all on display in cabinets there. The Garibaldi panorama is very interesting. It depicts the Italian struggle for independence, and it would be put in a large sort of music hall, and music would be played, and a narrator would change the images. They were on sort of a giant scroll, and an organ would play. So it was very dramatic. It was sort of a predated movie, so to speak. And then the John Cullen Murphy, you can see first the tears there. These came out of his sketchbook. So this is an example of artwork coming out of the sketchbook. And in 1995, the collection Peter Harrington organized, it did an outreach to a lot of people and artists and Brown alums, I think actually as well, to seek donations to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the end of World War II. And one of those artists that he received images from, I think we have about 35 images of John Cullen Murphy. The family donated those to the collection. And then in 2012, many years later, they donated Mr. Murphy's World War II letters that he sent home from the Pacific. He was in the war for the entire war. He wrote his mother every other day. We have 1,000 of his letters, and we're going to be doing a separate presentation on just John Cullen Murphy. Next, please. So one of the things that I've sort of found interesting as I've been involved with the collection is, in this collection, there, as I said, hundreds of artists, and you have just professional artists. And Orlando Nori is just an example. So Orlando Nori was not a soldier. He was not a soldier at all, but he was a professional artist. And if you see, you can see his art is very accurate, but it's just sort of, I don't want to say stiff, but it's just sort of very formal. He would go where the British Army was, for example, training in the UK, where they're on maneuvers, just training, and he would set up shop, and he would get soldiers who would commission him, and he would paint them. Whereas Harry Reeks here was a Marine artist embedded with Marines. He was a Marine first and then an artist, and we have over 150 of his images. And you can see it's just very, very realistic. This is just a real combat scene. I mean, he was at this combat scene. It's very realistic here. And Herbert Knodel, same thing. So he was a German soldier who was wounded in the First World War, but he was also a professional artist. And he painted figures from all sorts of different periods in history, and he was active in the early to mid part of the 20th century. And this is just a Hessian from the American Revolution. And you can see, for example, the mud on his boots, that sort of thing. He'll have soldiers that'll have their toes sticking out of the shoes, just depicting sort of the real, this is not all spiffy, right? He's been in the mud hiking around. And so that we see the difference in the different styles of the artists. Next, please. One of the things too that's interesting about the collection is how things are brought into the collection, and there are many different ways that things can come to the collection. So first, dealers will approach the university, approach the curator, or the curator will approach the dealers, and they'll have material that will be of interest, and we would acquire them. And Mrs. Brown would do the same thing. One of the pieces tonight we'll look at was acquired from the Verger diary was acquired from a dealer. The second is auctions, and just material comes up at auction. Again, Mrs. Brown bought things through auction. The Faber du Faur art that we have was bought at an auction. So that's just another venue to collect material. The third, or as I've talked already a little bit about, are the donations. And the fourth, sort of interesting, in certain instances, Mrs. Brown would commission art directly from certain artists that she knew personally, and she would commission art from them. And then the other thing that she did was that she knew some collectors that had military art collections, and she would buy their collections outright from them and embed them into her collection. So there are a variety of different ways to bring things into the collection. So I just thought it was interesting to sort of point that out, the different ways that things end up there. Next, please. This is the last image on the sort of introduction to the collection. The collection is very involved in various sorts of publishing activity, and really part of our mission is just to create awareness. So, doing outreach like we're doing tonight, talking with you, just creating awareness of people who have interest in it, sort of sharing the material that's in there. So these are a number of books. As I noted, Peter Harrington, a couple of these are his here. Some of the other trustees have done books as well. This book on the right here, Bernard Cornwell, you'd recognize that name. He wrote the Sharps Rifle series, the popular historical fiction, but he wrote actually one nonfiction book about the Battle of Waterloo. And in his book, he used images from the collection, so the reproductions of our art in his book. This book, With Napoleon in Russia, that's where all the Faber du Faur art was done in a book. That it depicted all the images around that invasion, occupation of Moscow, and retreat. And then I sort of will segue here in the lower left corner. This is a series of 3 diaries, including the de Verger diary that Mrs. Brown collected, and she transcribed, translated, and annotated all 3 of these diaries in connection with another scholar. And so she herself was involved in publishing her. And so I can segue here to de Verger. We'll just, next, please. So I'd like to introduce the first of the 2 sort of military soldier artists that we'll take a little bit of a look at. So we have in the collection, and the de Verger diary is considered one of the most prominent items that we have in the collection. It's a diary that a young French officer kept during the American Revolution. And this image here is an image inside the inside jacket of his diary. So he did a self-portrait. And he was in a French unit called the Royal Deux Ponts Regiment. They're actually in a part of France today that's actually part of Switzerland. So it was in the Far East, really in what is now part of Switzerland. And he was very young. He was 17 when he joined his unit, and he came to the US. He was just in for a couple of months, and then he ended up getting shipped out. He joined at age 17 in February of 1780. He gets shipped out in May, comes to Newport in July of 1780. They're there for about a year, and then they go down to Yorktown in the fall of 1781. He's at the Battle of Yorktown. We'll look at some of these things. Goes into winter quarters after the Battle of Yorktown, and then he starts his diary. So his diary is 2 journals. The one was looking back sort of the year 1780 through 1781, and then the second piece was 1782 until they left the U.S., America at the end of 1783. They left. They left, and so that's sort of the chronology. Mrs. Brown acquired this one from a dealer, a prominent New York dealer who knew that Mrs. Brown was very interested in this diary in particular because of the images in it. Next, please. So these are all of the images that are in the diary, and we'll talk about we'll talk about some of them in just a moment individually, but I just wanted to show them all to you. The ship that he came on here, we'll go into these. This one in the middle is a very prominent image, particularly because it depicts a Black soldier in a combat role, not in a serving role or a support role, but in a direct combat role, and we'll talk about that too in a minute. But these were the images that were sprinkled throughout the diary. Next, please. So this is the boat that they came to America on, and it's the Comtesse de Noailles. It's this boat, the ship on the top. And I point out here, you can see that the handwriting of de Verger that Mrs. Brown had to transcribe and then translate. So it was truly a labor of love to do that. This boat was described as an old tub by some of the officers on the boat, 550 tons, and there were 250 soldiers on it. Next, please. One of the things on the ship, and de Verger in his diary, he talks a lot about nature, different animals he sees during his time in America. And I'm just going to share an entry that he wrote in the diary about these flying fish that he saw on the voyage across the ocean coming to America. He describes them saying, that they average about 8 inches in length. They have 2 large hollow fins shaped like wings, which when inflated permit them to rise into the air and fly about 50 feet. So long as their wings are wet, this is the only defense nature has provided them against the dorados, some of which are 3 feet long. So just to give you a context, I put the dorados and the flying fish. Some of these flying fish would fly and get caught in the masts, and they could catch them and they would actually eat the fish. But so he was very curious, and he kept a very objective diary. He wasn't providing a lot of opinions. It was just more things he was observing. And so he talks about birds and skunks, opossums, beavers, all these different animals throughout the diary. And I just wanted to share one example there of his observation. Next, please. One of the big, real eye opener for him, he arrived in Newport in July of 1780, and just a couple months later, there's this large Indian Four Nations conference where General Rochambeau meets with the Indians really to try to secure the alliance with them. And there's ceremonies and they're giving gifts, and de Verger is interacting with them, and you can see he has very great detail of these Native Americans that he saw firsthand, and was at this conference that they were there in Newport for a few days. And he describes this, he said in his diary, he writes that they examined my epaulet and asked for my sword knot, explaining by signs that they would hang it from their nose as an ornament. And he describes too the music that they were playing, the drums they're beating. He said they were listening intently to one of their comrades, amusing himself by beating a small drum in a very monotonous fashion, and who seemed utterly entranced by the sounds he was making. And lastly, he says they habitually oil their bodies and paint certain parts with rouge. Rouge is their favorite color. And you can see here, obviously, this Native American here has painted himself red. Goes on to say they slit their lobes, they slit the lobes around the edges of their ears until they hang down to their chins, weighed down by various small ornaments. So really very intrigued by these Native Americans coming to Newport. Historians find the entry and the description about the music interesting because there's not a lot of descriptions of music made by Native Americans. So he's describing the drumbeat, the methodic drumbeat. So that's something that's interesting within the diary. Next, please. So this is a depiction of a small unit action. So in that first year he was in America, they were based at Newport, basically from July of 1780 to about August 1781 when they shipped down to Yorktown. But this is an example of a small unit action, and it's sort of multiple steps. So here you see on the right, these are the ships bringing in the French army. These little boats are putting them onto shore. They get on the shore and they march up here and they form up, and they're attacking this small British, this Tory fort on Long Island. And so it's a multiple steps here in one image. And as a military officer, of course, he was interested in, this is his profession, and this was the one real action they had in the first year they were in Newport, and they sailed from Newport down to Long Island to launch this raid. But it didn't go well. The sort of fog of war, there was confusion, a lot of things there was a friendly fire incident. But he describes part of this attack that I'll share with you. He wrote, as they're lined up here, he said, "We proceeded to form a line of battle within half a cannon shot of the fort, then halted while the enemy kept shelling us with grape shot from the 2 cannons, which you can see here. And since their palisade had already been breached in several places, we expected to march to the assault. We were all very much astonished to hear the command to retreat." So they were here, all ready to go. They were getting shot upon, and then instead of attacking and finishing off this small fort, they actually just had to retreat back through the woods, back to the beach, back out to the boats. And it was on this retreat where the units spread out had had a friendly fire incident. No one was really seriously hurt, but it was just part of that overall confusion. So he was frustrated because it just didn't go well. They didn't achieve their objectives. And he captured that in this image. Next, please. So this is really the one big image he has from the fight at Yorktown. And as I mentioned when I showed all of the images, this is sort of the iconic image from the diary that many people just know about the collection from the de Verger diary and this image. And this image is used regularly, reproduced. It's reproduced about once a month. Some organization, newspaper, book, article, something will reproduce this image. And Yorktown was the only part in his diary where he's writing daily entries. Every day he's describing what's happening with the siege. It was sort of a siege battle, and he pays tribute to the American soldiers. And this rifleman here. First, I just want to read one description of the rifleman, because this is sort of something we all hear about in history books of, the Minutemen and the guerrilla warfare. And he describes this. I think this really captures it well. He says, the English suffered quite a lot from the American riflemen, some of whom are very expert marksmen with a long rifle. They never faced the enemy as a unit, but individually, hiding from bush to bush until they brought their quarry within range. Then they picked off a sentry and, having fired, fled as fast as their legs could carry them. They rarely missed their mark. I learned that day we arrived, the riflemen killed 8 sentries in this fashion. So, just recognizing this sort of the tactics used here and depicted in this rifleman. So the other praise that he provides is on the sort of the standard infantrymen, which are these two on the left. And he describes them. He says, the American Continental troops are very war-wise and quite well disciplined. They are thoroughly inured to hardship, which they endure with little complaint. Of all their corps, their light infantry is the most praiseworthy. And these two here on the left are the light infantry. And the black soldier was actually from a unit in Rhode Island, the 1st Rhode Island Regiment. It was a very distinguished unit. It fought from the very start of the war to the end of the war. There were 140 black soldiers in the regiment, and it was the only regiment that had black soldiers that fought as an entire unit together in companies. And it's very interesting because in 1778, sort of before the French arrived, there was a real shortage. The Continental Army needed manpower, and Rhode Island had to provide a certain number of troops, and they didn't have enough manpower to fill it. So they were allowed to allow slaves to join this regiment. And there were 80 slaves that joined the regiment. And of those 80 slaves, about 25 had come directly from Africa. And the deal that was made with the slaves that joined was that if they served in the unit throughout the war, that at the end of the war, they would be granted their freedom. And this was a very tough fighting unit. They fought in the Battle of Rhode Island soon after being recruited, and they faced off against Hessians who charged them multiple times. They held, and they were in other battles throughout the war as well. So really a distinguished group, and it is sort of ironic they were fighting for both American freedom but their own personal freedom. And again, I note that it is this sense that they were not digging trenches and moving supplies. They were frontline soldiers, and we sometimes lose that lesson in American history. Next, please. And this will be our last de Verger slide. So I did mention that the de Verger image of these 4 is very frequently reproduced. And this is from the Wall Street Journal just in January of this year, just from a few weeks ago. There's a book in the book review section. This image was used for a new book on the American Revolution, and they just put this image in as the image of choice. And there's a book about the unit, and the image is on the cover of the book. If you go to Wikipedia, the image shows up there. It's pervasive, and it is used quite regularly. So I just wanted to show that to folks. Next, please. So that's de Verger, a sort of taste of de Verger and his diary and his art. And just going to shift gears. Our last piece of last piece of the presentation is about a German artist from the German state of Württemberg. His name is Christian Wilhelm von Faber du Faur. We just really refer to him as Faber du Faur, 32-year-old lieutenant who was with the Russians that went, with the French that went in to invade Russia. And he received honors at the Battle of Smolensk. Professional artist and professional soldier. This image here is of his unit firing in action at Smolensk. And next, please. I want to put in a very quick context. This is an infographic. This is probably one of the first versions of first version of an infographic. This was published in 1869, so long after the 1812 invasion. The only thing I want to point out here is this tan line. This is the size of the French army when they crossed into Russia. This is a map of the Russia. So they came in, they went all the way up to the far right is Moscow. And then the black line going back is the retreat. And it represents the size of the army. So you can see how massive it was when it went in. And then how small it was when it went out. 600,000 troops went in and less than 100,000 came out. So I wanted to it's sometimes hard to keep that in perspective. It's just the amount of losses. There were 250,000 horses, 180,000 of those horses did not make it out. Next, please. So I just wanted to give that little context on Faber du Faur. Mrs. Brown acquired his artwork at an auction in Munich, and it was, not too expensive, and it includes, all these 16 separate watercolors, 73 inserted or mounted in their colored ink, watercolors, wash sketches. So this album here, Faber du Faur put it together after he came back from the campaign, and this is just a snapshot inside the album. So you can see some of the loose ones as well as the album with some of the sketches. And next, please. So this is quite different than the de Verger diary in that, so while he was on this retreat, which is really sort of incredible, he not just retreat, the invasion and retreat, he was in a division of 15,000, and he was one of only 100 survivors from that division. So their casualty rate over 99%. So the fact that he made it out with this art that he had done is pretty incredible for posterity. But so he didn't write a diary like de Verger did. He sketched. His diary was all sketches. And in 1816, 4 years after he got out, there was a small exhibit of his sketches. But really, where it really came to life in terms of a complete artwork was he was commissioned to take his sketches and make them into full color art. And a publisher engaged him, gave him a contract, and he did 92 color drawings and put them into a publication that he added the descriptions of each of the images. He did this with one of his fellow survivors. So the two of them spent this time together, 15 years after the invasion to recapture the entire process. So he had this lieutenant, Friedrich von Clauser was his fellow officer, and they were sort of a sounding board. So they were able to Faber du Faur did all the art. Von Clauser was not an artist, but they were in a controlled environment in the studio, so he could take his sketches and make them into full color artwork to depict the invasion, the occupation of Moscow, and then the subsequent and fateful retreat. Next, please. So there are a number of images here, and so this was one of the first ones where and I wanted to show this because image here, this is the first type of sketch he would have done in the field. Very sort of basic. Well, that wasn't so basic, but you can see pretty good detail. But this is the type of sketch you do in the field. And then down here, the lower left, more detailed studies. And then on the right is the full color art that came out of it. So you can see from the sketch work, which was drawn up into the final artwork. And this is just depicting Faber du Faur's unit trading with local Jews who didn't leave. They didn't leave. They didn't want to be refugees. So they stayed when the French army and their allies came across the border and attacked, and they traded with the army. So they're buying here an animal skin from this, there's a transaction with an animal skin that's being sold. So this just gives you a sense of just the sketches being worked up into final art. Next, please. When the army went in, they were drastically short on supplies. They had to forage off the land, but the land had been picked over. So he has a number of images of the troopers going out to try to round up, livestock, fodder for the horses, anything they could get their hands on. And he notes, so when he did these images, he would put descriptions in that. He describes a description here. He says, we were not issued with any food, nor did we come across supplies or inhabitants willing to sell them. We were obliged to scour the land with detachments and take what we needed by force. And it is pretty telling that of his 90 odd images, there's several here you can see of foraging. Next, please. So as the army is advancing into Russia, they're starting to have casualties, not from battles, but from just exhaustion and heat and forced marches. One period in 2 days, they did 70 miles. They suffered from influenza, dysentery, typhus, diphtheria, all sorts of diseases. And these are some of the light infantry of Faber du Faur's unit. And he describes this saying, he said, at each halt, each camp, we noticed that the number of effective troops diminished. The vast majority of these exhausted troops turned into corpses and marked the rout of the army. So you can just see this very, there was nothing, he didn't candy coat anything. I mean, he really showed exactly what he was seeing. And again, you can see the sketches here of these deceased soldiers and then the color artwork. Next, please. As the army continued to advance, though, they did start to have smaller battles with the Russians, and this is just the aftermath of a small battle where there are dead soldiers from combat on the field, and he describes them, the bodies that had been exposed to the burning sun, and it was a horrible sight, and the air was thick with the stench of death. One thing to note, you see these deceased soldiers with their bare feet, but their boots were taken off of them by either other soldiers or locals. Their shoes were of high premium, so they were always stripped of their shoes. Next, please. So this is the first really big battle they have is at Smolensk. This is just a dramatic image of the city burning. 85% of the city was burnt. The French had a lot of casualties here, about 10,000 casualties. Russians, a similar number. The consequence of this fire was that when they were retreating from Moscow, they couldn't take winter quarters in Smolensk because it was basically burned down. Next. So this is a unit, a picture of the unit in action at Smolensk, and he was in the artillery. So this was his unit firing. And what he points out here and he describes is behind them, Smolensk was a walled city, and what was happening was the Russians were firing back at them, and he describes this. I'll read his description. He said, "Cannonballs still bounced towards us, plowing through the soil and showering us with earth and stones. Even if we thought the danger over, a number of us were still wounded by cannonballs, ricocheting off the walls behind us and once again into our ranks." So even things passing them can still hurt them on the rebound here. So that you can really see the wall there. Next, please. After Smolensk, there was a huge battle at Borodino. This was the largest battle of the entire campaign, and there were 40,000 casualties on each side. And this is the aftermath of that battle. Just many corpses throughout this landscape. And you know, he has a dramatic description saying, you know, that Borodino was fought with 120,000 men on each side and more than 1,000 pieces of artillery, vomiting death and destruction the entire day. And he was very frustrated. There was really no, it was a Pyrrhic victory. The Russians retreated. They were sort of beaten, but they were not defeated totally, and they retreated. So this is just a really horrific battle that the French lost. They lost 14 lieutenant generals, 33 major generals. So it just is, the corpses were all intermingled among each other between the different nations combatants. So it's a real bloody, terrible battle. Next. So the Russians retreat through Moscow. They're not going to defend Moscow. The French arrive, the city is empty, and then that was the start of the fire, and the fire burned for 5 days. 2/3 of the city buildings were destroyed. You can see this is sort of depicting this, and again, the sketches of some of the locals here, and the city burning. Next, please. So they were in Moscow a month, and so that there wasn't really fighting going on at that time when they're in there. It was September, like early mid-September until mid-October. They were about a month. So they went out, did a little bit of, I don't want to say sightseeing, but they did go out and see some things. This was the Church of the Old Believers. This is Faber du Faur's unit. So, you know, you have this horrific combat, then you have this bucolic scene here. He just said this was a most dazzling sight. Cupolas were blue and speckled with golden stars, and they towered forth over the brilliant masses of autumnal leaves. So there's just a small respite before the fateful retreat. Next, please. This is the army leaving Moscow on the 19th of October. Again, you see a sketch here of this figure here on the bottom left of the color image. And Napoleon, of the 92 images, there are 3 that have depict Napoleon, and this is Napoleon right there in the center. He describes this start of this march that it would result in the annihilation of the entire army. Next, please. On the retreat in November, you know, they leave sort of mid-October, but November 8th, it was almost like a light switch. The snow came, the temperature dropped, and this is Napoleon there. This is Napoleon, you know, cowering by a fire with everyone else as his army marches by. So just a complete, you know, a disaster. And, you know, they're freezing here constantly. And the temperatures, various diarists talk about 15 below zero, 20 below zero, 30 below zero, crazy, crazy temperatures. Next, please. This is a sort of a typical scene, a very, I don't want to say iconic, but just a very typical scene where they're retreating, the horse has died that carries the sledge, there's a few soldiers there, they're dependent on the rear guard. The rear guard might save them. If not, they're going to be captured or they might freeze. So he describes that this is sort of a typical scene that's happening every day on the retreat. Next slide, please. As they're retreating, they had to cross the Beresina River, and this was just a sort of, if you will, a sort of scene from hell, because the whole army is coming up, and they've built 2 temporary bridges, and there's just a mad dash to try to get across the bridge. And soldiers that had abandoned their weapons weren't allowed to cross. So any combatant who had their weapon could go first. And so the ones that didn't they had to wait, and the Russians were firing down on them. And it was just this scene from hell where the Russians were firing in, and he describes it saying, you know, people were thrust into the freezing waters of the Beresina, or they were pushed into the flames of the burning house between the 2 bridges. The desperation of this mass reached fever pitch. Each Russian shell found a target, and swaths of the unfortunates were cut down. In a convulsed way, they surged forward, crushing the dead and dying underfoot. So it's just like one calamity after another, the army experiencing. Next, please. So this is, let me just see here. This is our last image, and this is just, so the army is just about out of Russia. They're just about to leave, And this is a final scene. In the background there are the Cossacks who are harassing them. Throughout the entire retreat, the Russians were harassing the retreating French army. And so I will just, the way he described this was, you know, the savagery that went on, not only with just fighting in the cold and the elements, but the treatment of the army with their own comrades. You know, he describes this saying, you know, the cold was getting worse and we were losing men and horses. The army dragged itself forward, littering the road with its dead, dying, and deranged. We were constantly harassed by bands of Cossacks greedy for booty. Armed men gathered in bands, and there were running battles in the snow with a few pieces of artillery dragged all the way without horses, firing their final discharges in Russia. Mixed in with such bravery was, however, as much cruelty and a revolting selfishness. The strongest pillaged the weakest. The sick were stripped of their clothing, and the dying were robbed of their clothes and left to die in the snow. An instinct for self-preservation had snuffed out all traces of humanity in the human heart. And that's just sort of a really depressing way to end it, but that was the retreat. They lost 500,000 men in 6 months and 180,000 horses. So it was just a really catastrophic, you know, campaign that gained nothing. It gained absolutely nothing. So that is a sort of a whirlwind of the collection and de Verger and Faber du Faur. I do a separate presentation both on de Verger and on Faber du Faur that just talks about them. So it's, you know, we go into more depth. But I wanted to try to give you a sort of a flavor for the collection itself, as well as a couple of the prominent artists in it. So I hope that you enjoyed it, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Andrew, that was amazing. That was a really great, you know, showing of all the different art and just what goes on there. I have just one comment right now in the chat box. It says, it's from Nancy, the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, all Black, were encamped on the street where I grew up in Ardsley, New York.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Yeah, they were all over the colonies during the war, that unit. So, yep.
One question. You mentioned all those 28,000 images that are accessible online. How do you access those? Do you have to get a login, or where do you go to look at those?
You can go to you can search ASKB Military Collection, and the collection has a website, and within the website, there's something called the Digital Archive. And from the Digital Archive, you can then go in and you can search all the different art that's in there. So it's available to the public, and there's no cost or anything to access that material.
Does anybody else have any other questions or comments? Oh, Grace,
Drew?
yes.
Didn't you write a book, Drew?
I did the
You did
one.
not mention it. I saw it.
Well, Paul mentioned it in the intro. I did the one on Knodel, Herbert Knodel, on some of his German army units. But he did all sorts of different units from different periods of history. But yeah, I did his on the German ones, and one of the other trustees did a book on Herbert Knodel on his Russian armies. One of the things that's interesting about Herbert Knodel, that was an artist that Mrs. Brown commissioned art from directly. After the war, after World War II, he was in Berlin, and you know, it was a hard time. I mean, people were starving, and he was hired by the Allies to go out and scope out the Russians and paint the units, paint the different uniforms of the Russians, so the Americans would know what the different Russians looked like. So he's sort of an artist spy. I mean, not spy in air quotes, but he would go and look at the Russians that were standing around Berlin. Then he'd go back and he would sketch them and draw them, and then give that artwork to the Allies. Other officers, American officers that were there in Berlin with Knodel, also commissioned art from him because they saw how great of an artist he was. So Mrs. Brown wasn't the only one who was commissioning art from Herbert Knodel. And his father also was a very prominent military artist, and we have a bunch of his work as well, Richard Knodel. So he was very prominent as well. Sorry, you're muted, Susan.
I love all the anecdotes. Another question, were the soldiers made of wood, soap, or stone?
Well, so the soldier, they're lead. They're lead. It's lead soldiers, and they're hand painted and made of lead. And she collected. Mignot was a big manufacturer that she collected. I think what happens with people collecting toy soldiers, I collected a few myself over the years. After a while, you sort of get saturated and you want to go on to the next thing. I think she had plenty of toy soldiers, so she started getting all that artwork to further her knowledge of their uniforms. She got curious about the uniforms from the toy soldiers and then started getting books and art and to extend her knowledge. I can't hear you, Susan.
How many journals are in the collection and how many letters?
Well, I mean, there are hundreds and hundreds of journals and thousands of letters. Yeah, I don't have an exact number, but it's vast. I mean, there's over 20,000 books, and so there's unit histories and diaries, journals, all sorts of things. But although, as I said, the de Verger diary is definitely one of the most prominent ones from the collection, just because of the images it captures.
A person visiting the the library, can you look at these things, or do you have to be a researcher, or how does that work?
You can go and you can visit. It's open. It's not open on the weekends. It's open during basically business hours. I think it's 10 to 5. You can wander into the collection and look at anything that's right there. The soldiers and the oil paintings and posters on the wall. If you want, and the books are there too. If you know what you're looking for, the curator would get it for you. Some of the material is stored off-site, so if some researchers that are there, they know they want certain things, they have to bring them up from the annex, and it takes about a day to get it up to the Hay, and then they can use the material there. So yeah, so it's open to the public. As I said, though, you can't take the material out, you can't check it out. Yeah.
Else have any other questions or any other comments? Well, here's another one. Wasn't the time depicted in Russian photos the same as the American Revolution? Is there a distinction for the American Revolution soldiers and battles?
Sorry, I don't quite get that question. Wasn't the time depicted in the Russian photos the same?
Well, I was.
So no. So
No.
the American Revolution was the 1780s, and the Russian, that was 1812. So he was depicting the 1812. So it was, whatever was that, sort of 20 odd years later, give or take. Yeah. Is there a distinction for the American Revolution soldiers and battles? Is there a distinction? I'm sorry, I don't quite understand what you mean. Is there a distinction?
In the collection, are they set out where we can see the colonies versus the European side? Did she collect soldiers that were distinctive from the American side or just the European side? I mean, how was that distributed?
Yeah, well, yeah. She collected soldiers of Americans and British and all different countries, and they're in units together in roughly chronological order. That what I call that march of history. So it starts with some Egyptians and Greeks and Romans, and then it goes from there right up through World War I. So she would have British and French units from World War I, and German and Napoleonic period. They're very colorful. The uniforms from that period are very colorful, and so they're all there too. And the soldiers are in a cabinet. There's 2 levels of soldiers. So there's 2 levels. It's like 2-story of soldiers. That the way the display is set up. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks. Anyone else have any other questions? Oh, here's another one. Sorry, Andrew, can you tell us how you developed your interest in these topics?
Yeah. So as I think as a child, I also collected these toy soldiers, and that got me interested in history. A sort of visual learner, I guess, or like the visual aspect. And I would collect them, and I've collected them over the years. So that sort of got me going as a kid. and then I majored in history at Brown, and but that was how it started with me, just sort of liking the different units and the colorful uniforms, and yeah. And you know, the thing I should say too is that, like, the ASKB Brown Military Collection, we're you know, our mission is to share this material. It's not to promote war or to make a positive or negative comments about it. It's just to support research, to support awareness. You can see some of those images. There's nothing candy coated about it. War is horrible. We're seeing that today, right? I mean, what's happening in current events, it's absolutely horrible. And these artists capture that same thing throughout history, right? It's, you know, the suffering, and it's over centuries. It's been the same thing. So we capture that, and there's a lot too in there beyond. It's just the caricatures and the heraldry. There's so many other things related to it. You know, that are to collectively provide, I really think, a broad array of information for scholars and, you know, interested parties. Great.
Anybody else have any other last minute burning questions? Anyone? Okay,
Good.
all right. Paul, you want to finish?
Well, Andrew, we thank you for your knowledge and your wisdom. You did a wonderful job of telling the story of the collection. Certainly, I learned a heck of a lot. And, you know, for people who had read War and Peace way back many years ago,
Right.
there's some wonderful pictures that bring the story of War and Peace back to life.
Yes. Yep.
It was a horrifying experience for those people. And it's a good time to be reminded of that.
Yeah.
Thank you for your time.
Good. No, thank you all. Enjoyed spending time with you, and thank you for your interest.
Thanks so much, Andrew.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Good night.
Good night.